Hallo zusammen, es fand eine Ansprache von Seiten Jerome Powell statt und die Riksbank hat ein International Symposium on Central Bank Independance organisiert und dazu möchte ich gerne meine Stellung nehmen. Zuletzt haben die Teilnehmer dann die Fragestellung der Journalisten beantwortet und dazu möchte ich meine Meinung, mein Kommentar abgeben. Schauen wir uns das Ganze nun mal an.
When the public is involved, a Q&A session. So if you want to say something, please raise your hand. If you want to pose a question, if you do get the mic, please start by saying your name. Please be succinct, and please try to relate to the overall theme of the of the panel. Okay, Richard Portes, please.
Yeah, we're coming through. Richard Portes, London Business School and European Systemic Risk Board, where I have learned over several years a great deal from Stefan English. No more of that now, but maybe later. I'm not totally convinced that we now have a resilient system. Mark Carney said that in 2017 as his final statement from the Financial Stability Board. But then the banks, yes, but we found in early 2020 that that wasn't true of the non-banks, in particular the money market funds, and the central banks had to step in. Central banks don't like to do that, quite rightly. They don't like to have to act as market makers of last resort. And that may be a compromise of the mandate.
Also stopp mal hier, also der Mann ist für mich etwas, der Journalist ist ein bisschen schwer zu verstehen, er nuschelt etwas, aber ich versuche dazu mein Statement abzugeben.
So the questions that I would put to the panel, as we've seen, very recently, the rise in nominal rates is exposing financial fragilities in the system. They came from the search for yield, whatever you want to call it. And we saw an extreme example of that in the United Kingdom in September of this past year. Now, in those circumstances, should financial stability be explicitly in the mandate? Should we be recognizing reality, what central banks actually do in practice? Would that help avoid financial dominance if it were in the mandate? Given the huge costs of financial crises, is financial dominance in a sense inevitable? Recognize reality and put financial stability in the mandate. Why not?
Wants to take a stab on that?
I mean, in a sense, it is in the mandate of most central banks now. And I think it needs to be linked explicitly to the instruments of central banks. This was the problem before. And the obvious instrument is whether you call it lender of last resort to banks or the equivalent to the non-bank sector. And I think that the central banking community is very focused on the question of defining the circumstances and the nature of institutions that happen to be non-banks that would merit an intervention. And I think that the only way to handle this is to have a framework which is set out ex ante, which actually tries to identify clearly the circumstances and the institutions that would merit lending from the central bank, but also ensures that the scale of that intervention is also under the control of the central bank and not something which the actors themselves in the financial system can expand to almost any number simply by the actions that they take. It's ensuring that there is enough collateral against which to lend by the central bank. Now, I think the central banking community is well aware of these problems. It doesn't make them easy. It doesn't mean that you can do it in a week. But my guess is, yes, you're right, Richard, that there will be an expansion of the mandate and that it's there in principle, but it needs to be made much more concrete by saying, what are the institutions? What are the circumstances? whether it's maturity mismatch or something else, that would justify an intervention, and to have sufficient regulation on that degree of maturity mismatch ex ante to limit the size of the intervention.
Claudia.
Yeah, no, I agree that to some extent the framework for central banks to be involved in macroprudential policy is well defined. So the Bundesbank, according to the German financial stability law, has a clear mandate in that regard. It's a joint mandate with the supervisory authority and with the Ministry of Finance, because as we all know, there's a lot of distributional implications that macroprudential policy decisions can have. So it's not us alone. And I think also the ECB has clarified in its strategy review how monetary policy and financial stability interact. The one point that I would like to make in addition is that we also do have frameworks for evaluation of policies and whether we've done enough. So the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, started this big project in 2017 and looked at the reforms that have been implemented, found no major side effects, found that a lot has been achieved, but there are still also gaps when it comes to resolution reform. So I think also for the areas that you mentioned, the non-bank financial intermediation space, we clearly have to implement policies and look at the resilience in that part. So I fully agree. We can never say that the job is done and we can all lay back. That's what we're there for.
Jay, please.
Just to add, in the same spirit, I think that what the pandemic revealed was weaknesses in the non-bank financial sector, much as the global financial crisis revealed those weaknesses in the big banks and the large utilities, financial market utilities. And so there has been, as Claudia was saying, and Mervyn was saying, there's a lot of effort going into, and has been, in what do you do about money market funds? What do you do about the treasury market? These things are and I think the first order answers need to be changes to the structure of these institutions to make them stronger, more resilient on their own. I would say expanding the provision of central bank liquidity is not the desired response. It really is to strengthen these institutions. Our capital markets are quite vibrant and very different in what they do from what the banks do. And I wouldn't want to see the kind of prudential regulation that goes along with liquidity provision. I don't think it wouldn't be great to extend that too much into the non-bank financial sector. I'd rather work on structural reforms, which is kind of what we've been doing.
Klaus Eklund.
Hier mal ganz kurz Stopp, um das Ganze zusammenzufassen. Die Zentralbank hat ja unter anderem die Aufgabe, die Inflation zu stoppen. Das heißt, die hohen Inflationsraten, die wir zurzeit in den USA, in Deutschland sehen, dass die reduziert werden, und dies handelt eben die Zentralbank. Die EZB in Europa und die Federal Reserve in den USA. Die zweite Aufgabe der Zentralbanken ist, nach der Preisstabilität eben auch die Arbeitslosenquote in einem angemessenen Rahmen zu halten. Das sind die zwei Aufgaben, die die Zentralbanken, Hauptaufgaben, die die Zentralbanken haben. Und um jetzt auf die Frage und die Antwort der Teilnehmer, unter anderem auch Jerome Powell, einzugehen. Es wurde über Institutionen gesprochen, wo eben auch eine gewisse Sicherheit geschaffen werden muss in Zukunft, dass die stabiler werden. Es müssen einfach sicherere Mechanismen aufgebaut werden, sodass das eben nicht passieren kann, was in Großbritannien im September. Der Herr hatte ja Großbritannien erwähnt, ich nehme an, die Pensionskassenfonds, die in Schieflage geraten sind. Im September war das. Was war da, um das kurz nochmal zu erläutern? Dazu habe ich ein Video schon einmal gemacht. Das war praktisch ein kleiner Lehman-Effekt, den wir da hatten, wo eben die Pensionskassen nicht mehr in der Lage waren, Sicherheitsleistungen an die Bank of England abzugeben, da eben die Anleihen immer weiter gefallen sind. Und wenn der Wert einer Anleihe fällt oder auch der Wert einer Immobilie, dann ist man eben verpflichtet, eine Sicherheitsleistung zu hinterlegen, und die Pensionskassen waren dazu nicht in der Lage, und somit musste die Bank of England eingreifen und eben die 30-jährigen Staatsanleihen hauptsächlich kaufen. Das heißt, sie ist von einer restriktiven Geldpolitik in eine expansive Geldpolitik gelaufen. Und so sollte das nämlich nicht laufen. Die Institutionen müssen Sicherheitsmechanismen haben, damit eben solche Dinge in Zukunft nicht mehr passieren werden. Da kann ich auch raushören, dass Jerome Powell da zuversichtlich ist, dass dies in den USA mit den Pensionskassen nicht passieren wird, da vor allem dort auch die Höhe enorm um das 7-fache höher ist, also 7,5 Billionen US-Dollar. Wenn die in Schieflage geraten, dann sind wir wirklich in einer weltweiten Finanzkrise. Ob diese Sicherheit gegeben ist, das weiß man nicht. Da kann man nur spekulieren, und deswegen muss die Fed auch in Zukunft aufpassen, dass sie nicht zu weit die Zinsen anhebt und die Anleihen nach unten drückt damit. Weil wenn die Renditen der Anleihen steigen, dann sinken eben diese 30-jährigen Staatsanleihen. Und diese kaufen die Pensionsfonds auch über Kredite, die sie von den Zentralbanken geliehen bekommen. Das war zumindest bei den britischen Pensionsfonds so. Schauen wir mal weiter, was weiter in der Sitzung besprochen worden ist.
Thank you. Torsten, you mentioned that you did graduate studies together with Stefan. I can add that I actually made undergraduate studies together with Stefan, so I'm even older. But a question of independence. It seems that you have mainly been discussing central bank independence from, let's call it, political pressure. And of course, partisan pressure would be even worse. But there's something more subtle about the independence issue, which I think we can discuss in Sweden right now. I'm personally interested in that. I worked in the finance ministry many years ago, but I was also on the general board of the Riksbank, Riksbanksfullmäktige, not the board of directors, but the general board before, in the old evil days before independence. Anyway, in Sweden we have 4 institutions: the Riksbank, the Financial Supervisory Authority, the Debt Office, and of course the Minister of Finance. And they often work with similar issues, obviously. And they often have to cooperate. So the question here is, how independent can the central bank be in reality? To what extent must the central bank discuss, compromise, lean against the wind or with the wind, and be politically agile at the same time as it is formally independent? Maybe it sounds like a stupid question, but I think...
Ja, die Frage ist, inwieweit die Zentralbanken überhaupt unabhängig sein können. Weil wenn die Zentralbanken ja die Inflationsrate versuchen zu senken auf ein gewisses Niveau, sagen wir mal 2%, wie die Fed das auch vorhat, dann wird die Wirtschaftsleistung ja zwangsläufig herabgesetzt. Und inwieweit jetzt die Zentralbank von der Politik unabhängig ist. Und da ist meine Meinung ganz klar, die Zentralbank muss unabhängig bleiben. Und mal sehen, was hier in der Diskussion jetzt hier diskutiert worden ist.
Actually, this is almost as important as the, let's call it, the big issue of political independence. I'd like to hear sort of your experiences from this. How independent can the central bank really be?
Can I start by saying, I think we have to distinguish between monetary policy independence, where the case, I think, is very strong, from all the other activities of the central bank. So as a regulator, the United States Fed's very powerful, but there are many other regulators it deals with. And I think the same's true in most countries. So that it's very different conceptually, and I think all regulators, we'd like to be independent from over political influence and being bought off, or, you know, even if it's only psychically held hostage by those that it regulates. But I think that's, the central bank in general and looking at all its functions, it clearly has to coordinate with other agencies. It clearly has to be subordinate to political policy, as we had in the first session here.
So I can speak from my experience, which was that between 1997, when the Bank of England was made independent, and 2013, when I left, there wasn't a single episode where the elected politicians put pressure on the bank to adopt one interest rate policy or change rather than any other. Whereas, as Jay talked about, the facilities that were put in place in the US under the new regime, which was meant in some sense to give more control to elected politicians, we in the Bank of England in 2010 really introduced a compact between the Treasury and the Chancellor on the one hand and the Bank of England on the other, which said that any lender of last resort operation had to be approved by the Treasury. That seems to me perfectly reasonable and appropriate. And you have a private conversation where you explain why you want to do it. And in very few cases could I imagine that the Treasury would say, if the central bank feels that a lender of last resort operation is appropriate to prevent some collapse, the idea that the Treasury is going to say you can't do it, I think is not likely to be true. But since taxpayers' money is at risk, it's perfectly reasonable for the Treasury to have an input on it. There was never any conflict between these two different approaches in the different areas of policy. So I think the important thing is for it to be quite clear what that policy responsibility is, whether it's in the US with changes in legislation or the compact agreed between the bank and the Treasury in the UK. It's quite clear what the lines of responsibility are and who has to be consulted. That's the important thing. That's what prevents, I think, things going very wrong. It's where different institutions or players all feel that they are the people responsible for a particular policy that you get difficulties.
Yeah, or to express it differently and perhaps more simply, it's a big difference between taking the decision in deliberation with others or taking it after deliberation with others.
Yeah.
And that's the responsibility point, right? So, yes, please.
Meine Meinung dazu ist, dass die politische Unabhängigkeit der Zentralbanken sehr wichtig ist, wichtig auch für das Vertrauen der Anleger ist. Und somit, wenn dieses Vertrauen gebrochen wird, dann würde es einen Kollaps am Kapitalmarkt geben und es würde zu Crash-Zuständen am Kapitalmarkt kommen. Und gerade deswegen ist die Unabhängigkeit der Zentralbank von besonderer Bedeutung.
Much for the panel, Joachim Nagel for the Bundesbank. Let me put it like this. I think it was already said by Ken Rogoff. I think inflation is back now. We are more or less, in my interpretation, still in the midst of a storm, and the storm is not over. So we have to do our job, our main mandate. This is our role. During the last 10, 12 years, we were the most welcome partners of the politicians because we, in our independent role, we did everything to fight against all the financial crisis and did what we did. But this came with a price. And now in the next years, the politicians have to learn that monetary policy is coming with a price. So maybe some of us, they have to announce that there are maybe losses or not the profits we came up in the past. What is your opinion about that? Is that influencing the way we are being perceived in the future about our independency?
Auf jeden Fall hat die monetäre Geldpolitik Auswirkungen auf die Wirtschaftsleistung der USA und Europa. Das dazu nochmal. Was der Herr hier sagen will, ist, natürlich wollen Politiker immer mehr Einfluss haben, immer mehr Einfluss, um auch ihre Politik besser durchsetzen zu können, um wiedergewählt zu werden. Dafür tun Politiker sehr viel und die Politik Und die Zentralbank hat in der Vergangenheit aber gezeigt, dass sie sich nicht immer beeinflussen lässt. Das hat man zuletzt auch bei Donald Trump gesehen, der wirklich auch stetig Druck auf die Zentralbank, die Fed, geleistet hat. Aber die Fed hat Widerstand geleistet. Und das hat man wirklich auch gesehen. Und das führt dazu, dass die Anleger dann auch immer mehr Vertrauen gewinnen. Die Zentralbank darf hier keine Schwächen zeigen. Die Politik, auch in der Vergangenheit, will immer ihre politischen Ziele durchsetzen. Und da gibt es immer Diskrepanzen zwischen der monetären Geldpolitik und der Politik.
Someone else? No?
Well, I'll add briefly. I mean, clearly, there are many cases where, given the central bank's independence, politicians will look to the central bank, as Mervyn saying, to do something they should do, but they don't want to do, or political interests will say want something to do with inequality or something to do with the environment that they're not getting through the political system, and they'll view the central bank perhaps as an end around being able to implement it. But of course, at the end of the day, the central bank can't take political decisions consistently and maintain its independence. They're deep crises where the central bank just has to act. But I think in that case, it again is looking to the political system to back it up. If you go to developing economies, the normal rhythm of things is the central bank moves, but then the Treasury kind of takes over everything it did, and everybody knows that that's coming, and so it works that way because the central bank can move so quickly. But it needs to be very wary of taking political decisions.
Stefan.
Outside the topic of the panel, but since Ken, you are on the panel, I'll ask you anyway. You wrote a nice little book called The Curse of Cash. And in this environment, cash is disappearing. So what's your advice?
Well, isn't it wonderful that the people who organized this event had a panel just before us about this? But no, I think one of the things that's been very naive about I will call them crypto evangelists, is that they can somehow do something better and have an end around. And in fact, if you look at the history of money, which is probably what I should have called my book, and you look at the private sector always invents everything, but for many reasons, the governments eventually regulate it and even sometimes appropriate it. And I think, that's what we're seeing going forward in the digital space. You need rules of the road. And I was going to bring it up earlier, but I have to mention FTX. That was kind of a success for the regulatory community. It didn't do anything. It's the $32 billion at the heart of the crypto system just had no effect. And I think it shows how you need some regulatory structure to provide guardrails, and the central banks need to do that. But anyway, I've learned from you over the years on this issue, so thank you for asking that question.
Since we're spiraling out of control here with questions about anything, we should try to wrap up. So all good things must come to an end, and I'm not going to try to summarize what has been said, but I'd like to end with some final remarks. But really just 1 minute for each of you to summarize for the audience, which is the most important thing that we should take away from the panel. If you had to expound on one, which would that be? Who wants to take that first? Jay?
So I'll just conclude by saying that for us, central bank independence is a matter of statute. It's not in our Constitution. It's just an institutional arrangement that has served the public well, nothing more, nothing less. And as long as it does serve the public well over time, then I think it's safe, and I think it's safe now. But that means we've got to be committed to achieving our goals and to sticking to this precious grant of independence. To keep it, we need to deserve it, and that means stick to that work and don't look for broader things. Where it was discussed at the first panel, really, we shouldn't be getting ahead of where the public is if there's no specific mandate. And in the case of the U.S., that's a particularly salient point today.
Claudia,
Yeah, no,
it's your bottom line.
I fully agree with what Jay just said, and that's also, again, when you look at the German history, so sticking to the mandate and deliver. I mean, this is what's building trust, and I think when it comes to financial stability, we actually at a critical juncture because the system has not been fully tested, so we have to make sure that we also deliver on both of our mandates, price and financial stability.
Erwin?
All good things do not have to come to an end, and central bank independence is one of them. And I think the point that comes out of all this is you can have a debate about whether interest rates should go up, and if so, by how much, or go down a bit. That's to do with the actual decision that's being made in a moment. But institutional arrangements matter. They really matter. And that's why central bank independence, I suspect, will live longer than many good ideas.
I also believe central bank independence will go on for many decades to come. It's hard to know forever. And I would just again argue, as I said in my remarks, that it's really been maybe the most successful policy innovation post-World War II and continues to be.
Okay, let's stop at that and take early coffee. Thank you, with a big applause to the panel.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. I have one announcement to make. It's time for coffee, but there will be a dinner tonight, and I'll talk more about that later on today. But for those guests staying at the hotel, this hotel, please make sure to collect your coats during this break, because it will not